I think that's everything I need to do in terms of preliminaries. So I'm going to hand over to Kevin to share his screen and give us a presentation on the digital audit.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kevin Gosling, Chief Executive of Collections Trust. And I should say at once that most of the work that I'm going to be talking about was actually done by my colleague Gordon McKenna, but he can't be with us this afternoon because he's flying the Collections Trust flag for us at the CDOC conference in Tallinn. So as Rebecca said, Collections Trust was commissioned by the TANK programme to do an audit, the aim of which was to, let me find my controls. Where are my controls? Oh, that's interesting. My controls have disappeared. Ah, there we go. Thank you. The aim of this was to really try and understand just how much stuff was potentially out there that might form part of a national digital collections infrastructure. There's been surprisingly little work done on this in the past, so this was a real opportunity to really try and get to grips with this and to provide some answers. It was quite a lengthy process. I mean, we started back in last summer, and we started off with just a scoping exercise, which in part looked at some of the work that had previously been carried out and looked at some of the pros and cons of various approaches that we might have taken. We then came back with a couple of options, and the audit process itself started in the autumn. And went on to just sort of late January, just sneaking into February with the report that you can find on the website, published in March. So really quite a long process, and I'll just sort of take you through actually how we did it just very briefly. In the scoping report, we kind of thought about why we didn't have answers to some of these questions before now, and looked at some of the problems of previous attempts, I mean, including many that we had been involved with ourselves, particularly in connection with Europeana projects. And typically what you get is sort of, you know, these sort of apologies for cross-posting kind of self-selecting questionnaires that go out. It's often very difficult for people to really understand the questions because a lot of the key terms are ambiguous, or there isn't a kind of common understanding even about what a term like digitization might mean. There is the inevitable survey fatigue that I'm sure you all have, and you know, the kind of inevitable kind of just deleting anything that comes into your inbox, asking for you to kind of log on and complete a questionnaire. So that's a problem. Often surveys kind of lack any kind of statistical rigor, so you get these kind of self-selecting questionnaires that you know, a few people choose to respond to, and then in the extrapolation it's very hard to know whether this actually gives you any kind of sense of what's out there across the total population that's being studied. And it's just really hard and time consuming to just talk to the right people. So particularly within big institutions, it's often you need to get this kind of information from more than one person. It's often not a single individual who holds the answers to all of the questions that we had in mind. So those were some of the problems. In the end, the approach we agreed to follow was to target 263 of what we termed the most significant cultural heritage organisations, and those were organisations that fell within one or more of these defined categories that you can see on the screen. And the reason for restricting it in that way and not trying to sample all cultural heritage organizations was that would have been a very, very expensive process if you were to do it with full statistical rigor, and that would have kind of blown the entire budget. And we suspected, just from kind of our knowledge of smaller museums, that there would be a law of kind of diminishing returns. And I think that that's vindicated by the drop-off that we saw in results, even within this cohort of 263. So that was the main audit. We then teamed up with Adrian Cooper of Intelligent Heritage, and he took a deep dive into some more technical issues through some structured conversations with the technical staff, particularly in IROs, independent research organizations, and some other larger organizations. And then to really bring to the table some of the challenges that a program like TANK would face working with smaller museums and archives, we held some round tables, and the aim here was not to try and get any kind of quantitative data, but really just set down some of the qualitative concerns that those institutions in particular would have. So I'll say a little bit about those last two in a while. The way we did the main audit was to actually spend quite a bit of time up front just finding out who were the right people within those 263 organizations to contacting them first, kind of getting their buy-in to the process, and that did actually take quite a long time. So a lot of the time that we spent was spent just finding those right people. We then had an online questionnaire. We sent out the questions in advance. We did quite a bit of follow-up and nudging, and then we had to standardize the responses and then write a summary report. So it was quite a labor-intensive process. And again, kind of hats off to Gordon for doing most of that. But I think the approach that we took had resulted actually in a phenomenally high response rate. So 87% of the institutions that we targeted came back to us with responses. So that is really far higher than any other survey of digitized collections in the UK beforehand. So we've now got really, really good data. The sort of headline, I guess, was just how many records do you have of item levels, and there are about 146 million records reported by those respondents, and about 86 million of those were in the independent research organizations. Just over half were in just 4 large institutions, so the British Library, the National Archives, the BBC Archives, who we also included, and the Natural History Museum. And that was a pattern that was really repeated, not necessarily for those institutions, but for most of the questions, we found that just a handful of really big collections ended up with at least half of the responses. So in most cases, we looked at the median level as being a kind of a more reliable indicator of perhaps the typical position. So we also asked how many of those records had images or other digital media associated with them, and about a quarter, so 37 million item level records did have some kind of image, scan, audio, video associated. And again, the lion's share of those were in the independent research organizations. We did ask the very subjective question, can you just give us an estimate of what proportion of those are of publication or broadcast quality? And given that it is a very subjective estimate, perhaps 28 to 30 million of those are of that quality that you could use them for publication or broadcast. We also wanted to know how many of those records had been published on the institution's own websites. And here we came up with a figure of 98 million item level records published on institutions' own websites. And of those, 41 institutions had APIs which would potentially allow the reuse of at least some of that material. It's probably a big assumption to say that you could get all of them through the APIs, but if you could, that might suggest that up to 61 million records would be available through that route. And we're also interested in how many of those online records had images, and it was about 2/3 of the total images that were reported earlier were available online through institutions' own websites. Noting here that the National Archive was actually responsible for 36% of all of those. So again, the big mega collections really dominating many of these categories. We also asked a lot of other questions, and I mean, there isn't time, and it's not really kind of that interesting to go through everything in this webinar. You can read the full results in the report, but it's worth noting, for example, that 107 institutions reported that they had records that were only published by third-party sites such as Art UK, or in the case of army museums now, there is a new one called the Ogilvy Muster. So there is definitely a role for third-party sites helping to publish at least some of these records. Only 14 institutions said that they had material that was only available behind a paywall. Relating to a couple of other of the foundation projects that TANK funded, 39 of the respondents said that they had at least some images that were available as IIIF images, and only 14 used any kind of external persistent identifier to kind of really secure, make sure that online links were kind of fully future-proofed and not potentially vulnerable to kind of link rot over time. I mentioned that we also took a deeper dive into some more technical questions, and again, very, very kind of detailed, and there isn't time to run through everything. Adrian Cooper spoke to technical staff in 27, particularly large organizations, mostly independent research organizations. And I mean, some of the headline findings from that was that really very, very few organizations are using any kind of administrative metadata, which would become an issue the more we start the more we start sharing data in sort of machine readable ways. That kind of metadata will become important in a way that it currently isn't if you're just putting your data up on your own website. Almost nobody was using persistent identifiers, independent persistent identifiers, again, backing up the kind of general impression from not only the main audit, but also the persistent identifier foundation project. And I think, this is a concern. And only 4 had any kind of integrated kind of digital preservation system. And remember that these are among the very largest, most technically sophisticated organizations. So if this cohort of 27 are not doing these things, you can imagine what the situation is sort of lower down when we get to smaller organizations. And a lot of the experience of smaller organizations will be familiar to many of you watching. So we held 7 roundtables with small museums and archives, and kept hearing the same things over and over again, and it's really worth reading actually some of the transcripts of some of the conversations that we had, because you really get a sense of what's going on out there, at the coalface. So no surprise, documentation is a low priority. Yeah, we knew that. What really came out strongly for me was actually the sheer difficulties many staff and volunteers have getting access to their own data, often because they're using legacy collection management systems, often because there's only one or two licenses, or the database sits on one desktop in the museum. So, before we kind of run away with ourselves and imagine how we might share data with the nation, for a lot of museums, they can't even share their data easily with their own people, within their own buildings. So that really is worth kind of bearing in mind when we think about some of the challenges facing the sector. Images are amongst the most useful, particularly sort of local photographs, but as we all know, managing them is pretty hard. Quite a lot of the small institutions mentioned that they get practical help from Art UK, and the National Archives in particular were mentioned, and that this help is really, really welcome. A surprising number of very, very technical people are working in small institutions, and they're fully aware of the potential of cutting edge technology like AI. And they really want to be part of it. So I think one of the challenges is, well, how do we bring the benefits of cutting edge tech to really small institutions? A surprising number of people had a very much a kind of all or nothing approach to sharing their information data. So spent a long time explaining why they wouldn't be able to put their databases online, but nevertheless wanted to reach out and attract researchers and others. But they were not making use of existing infrastructure like the National Archive Discovery portal, and were just not posting even basic collection level information of the kind that would be extremely helpful to researchers. And finally, I'm afraid there was quite a bit of confusion and indeed cynicism about the TANK programme, and in particular just about that phrase, the national collection, and we have some thoughts about that. So turning to just the conclusions and recommendations, it was a consistent pattern really across many of the findings, that around 10% of the respondents accounted for about 80% of whatever kind of category of records and assets we were interested in, and that was true both online and offline. And in very many cases, a handful of mega collections, and in many cases the same, the British Library, the National Archives, Natural History Museum, kind of frequently mentioned, hold more than half the total. So there is kind of a real gap between the really big institutions and everybody else, even within this fairly small cohort of 263 of the most significant organizations. The concept of a national collection is problematic, and our recommendation was that really it's probably best to stop using that, apart from the name of the program itself, because you spend more time just debating what's in it and what's not in it, or unhelpful connotations of just the whole concept of nations and national. So it's not needed, and perhaps best just to find a different way of talking about what we're trying to achieve. Almost nobody's using persistent identifiers, and this seems to us to be a really big problem. And we think that if it's beyond the big IROs to do this, it's certainly beyond everybody else. So what we need to develop are solutions that take the onus off individual institutions, and it just happens if you're sharing your data, PIDs are assigned and you don't even have to think about it. So that would be a really strong recommendation. Support at scale, so of the kind that the National Archives and Art UK already offer, that is hugely welcome, and we think that there is scope for more of that, and that's going to be really the way that we get data out of these silos, particularly in smaller institutions, and get them available for Tank and anybody else to work with. And collection level records, we think, would be a huge start. So if one of the aims of Tank is to really make collections more accessible to researchers, then a few words that describe the significant holdings within a collection at collection level are better than no information at all. And there is already quite a lot of legacy data going back 10, 20 years to projects like Cornucopia that would give us an excellent head start on doing that. So we think that that's something that Tank could look at really as a kind of first stage towards, let's not call it a national collection, but national level data across the whole sector. Let's start with collection level. So that's it. I think, yep, that's pretty much bang on time. So thank you very much, and I'll now hand over to Rebecca again.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Great to see that summary of what we're all facing now. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass straight over to Sophia to take over, share her screen, and tell us about the user consultation.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. And thanks very much, Kevin, as well. It was fascinating, in a sense, to hear how many things we also found in our research coming at from a different angle. It's a fruitful juxtaposition, these two pieces of research, I think. I will just share my screen. So I am Sophia Whitley. I'm head of policy research at the Audience Agency. I'm joined by a couple of other members of the project team, my colleague Patrick Towell, who's Innovation Director at the Audience Agency, and also Enra Kennedy, who's Partnerships Director of Culture 24, which worked with us on the project. So they may pop in to make a few comments during the Q&A if they feel moved. The Audience Agency is a mission-led charity whose purpose is to enable cultural organizations to use data to increase their reach, relevance, and resilience. This piece of research, this is exactly the sort of user research that we love doing. One of the exciting things about it, but also challenging things about it, is that it was very, very early stage research. So we weren't being told, here's the offer, here's what the platform is going to look like, find out what people think about it. We were actually carrying on user research to think about what the offer might be. So that's wonderful and rare and interesting, but obviously poses some challenges in terms of what you are testing with people. The objectives of our research at its heart were to understand what a diverse range of users want and need from a future national collection digital research infrastructure. In particular, we were asked to think about how we might enable Tank to involve and benefit an increasingly diverse and inclusive range of audiences, not just the usual suspects, but actually widening people's contact with this wonderful, wonderful collections that exist in the UK. And finally, the third point is important here, to inform the development of services, experiences, etc., that might be built on top of this digital infrastructure. This is important because we didn't want to assume, and we kind of took this as a point of view from the start, that platforms that were owned and managed by the National Collection were necessarily the best way to engage all audiences. So there's this idea, I'll come back to you through the presentation, that this is an infrastructure that feeds the development by others within or outside the sector of things built on top. Our research was multi-stage. We knew that this was a complex project in terms of thinking about what we were testing. And so we wanted there to be multiple goes round. So we started by talking to key stakeholders to build our contextual understanding, to think about how we might frame what we were doing. Then we had initial consultations with user groups, a range of user groups, which I will discuss shortly, to develop our approach, to test out the ways we were talking about things, and to test out the design and the structure of our questions, basically. Then once we'd kind of digested the learnings from those initial framing sessions, we had bigger needs gathering sessions focusing on the needs of these various users using our refined research approach. It wasn't all qual, so we also ran a public survey with over 1,000 respondents. This was a roughly representative of the UK population. We had a panel, so we could draw representative findings from that to gather further quantitative insights. And then finally, at the end, we ran sense-making sessions, reconvening our professional user groups and bringing some new participants in to sense check and develop our findings, to say, well, what we've heard so far, we think this. Does that make sense? Have we come to the right conclusion? That was extraordinarily helpful. I'd like to thank everyone who participated. I noted a few familiar names in the audience today who have been in our sessions, so thank you very much. It was wonderful how many people contributed and helped us think through some of these things. So in terms of the users we consulted stakeholders from across GLAM, academia, public engagement, and the technical world. Members of the public, as I said, this was a survey that was broadly representative of the UK population. We focused on those with some current arts or cultural engagement because we thought these were the people that would be most likely to be engaged by TANK. And we ran workshops, some of which were general, but some of which had a specific focus. So we looked at young people in one workshop. And then we also broke it down into current users of UK collections who might have used archives, done family history, etc., or non-users of UK collections who were nonetheless engaged with arts and culture in some way. On the professional side, we looked at professionals from galleries, archives, libraries, and museums. We looked at academics, we looked at educators, and we also looked at representatives of the creative industries, because we're conscious of the fact that many people come into contact with these kind of resources and items, not necessarily directly by going to an archive or going to a library, but through the ways that the creative industries remix, reuse, popularize, spread out these things. So we wanted to kind of understand how creative industries might use such a resource to inform films or documentaries or books or journalism or what have you. So a really wide range of users. And we started out by looking at people's kind of current search and discovery methods. What we found was fascinating. All users, professional users and public users, rely heavily, and maybe it shouldn't be a surprise, rely heavily on Google for search, browse, and discovery, which really points to the importance, whatever the infrastructure, whatever the platform, of it having really good search engine optimization. It should show up on Google, the record should show up on Google without you having to search on the platform. Some of the technical people that we spoke to even suggested that this should be really the focus of the infrastructure, that it shouldn't be a catalog in itself, but if it just succeeds in surfacing better UK collections better on Google, that maybe that's the most important thing, which was an interestingly provocative idea. Beyond that, we found that other engagement, other search and discovery, relies on people knowing who to ask and where to look. So a lot of people said, you know, I'll know where to look, I'll guess, I'll say that's probably in the V&A, that's probably in the British Library. These findings about these big mega institutions, how many collections they hold relative to the whole, it makes a lot of sense that people would, in a sense, be able to guess and just search a particular institution to find what they were looking for. Or they might say, I'm looking for something that I know is about Cornwall, and so I'll look at the Cornwall archives. If people didn't know where to search, they would want to know who to ask. And this is particularly important for professional users. And it was particularly important for professional users, even if they knew which institution they were looking for. They often said it's really difficult to surface something from a catalog, even if I know it's there. And so I need to know who to ask, who at the institution will guide me through this maze of search. So personal connections, particularly for professional users, were really important. And to some extent, public users often contact institutions asking for help finding something. So human help is often necessary in the current system. Interestingly, we found that serendipitous unstructured discovery was highly valued by academics. They were a little bit skeptical, I suppose, about current aggregators because they found that the cataloging was quite standardized. And in a sense, they said, it's easy to find what we know we're looking for already, but it's quite difficult to find stuff that we don't know exists. And so they would try throwing random search terms into Google, searching things that they didn't usually search because they wanted to be surprised. And that was interesting. Professional users were very conscious of the inadequacy of cataloging and digitization, which should be no surprise to anybody, this being a barrier. And for public users and to some extent, students, paywalls and registration were seen as a major barrier to people finding what they wanted to find. It was important for us to think about kind of what need does a national collection fill? Where is the gap? Because that helps us think about what the service might need to be to meet those user needs. And the sort of two things that came across really strongly from stakeholder interviews in particular were kind of, this is something that's going to happen eventually. The data's out there. And if the sector doesn't do it, if the cultural sector doesn't control it themselves, it'll be done by Apple and Google. It'll be done by some big tech agency that harvests off the really important, really popular stuff and isn't so bothered about the rest of it. So one real motive was to say, we want something that belongs to us, that belongs to the cultural sector, that belongs to the UK, that is focused, is run as a public service, essentially, rather than something that's run for the benefit of some tech giant. And the other thing that was really mentioned as the value was that long tail of collections, the many, many small collections that exist that people don't know to look for, that get left out, but that have records, if people knew about them, if people could find them, that people really want to find and use. People are finding what's in the big mega collections already because they know that the British Library exists and they know that the Natural History Museum exists, but they don't know about these small organizations and they would have trouble searching them. So those were the needs that were discussed. We kind of looked at it in more granularity. I won't go into great detail about this, but for members of the public, people who already use collections really did see the value of this. They loved the idea of it being a one-stop shop. They could search in one place. It would be great. They're familiar with going around looking in different places. For people who aren't familiar with using collections items already, they really saw it. They were arts and culture attenders already, so they could see something like this as being valuable to inform physical visits to institutions, to find out what's there, to find out more about something while they were there. But that was the context in which they engaged with culture. And so that was the way that they could imagine that Tank might be useful to them. Academics thought about bringing together items that had been separated or removed from their original context, and about building knowledge through creating connections between records. GLAM professionals saw major savings in staff time by making search more efficient, hopefully, making more people able to search. They were excited about the idea of raising profile of items in small institutions, and they were excited about being able to facilitate collaboration between institutions. Educators also saw this sometimes in the context of physical visits, but also substituting for visits where possible, and were excited about the idea of a trusted platform where students could explore and they could be, send students there and not have them misled by interpretation, and could have context. So a lot of people were excited about a lot of different things, and there are some clear commonalities there in their needs and interests. What did we find in terms of commonalities? Stories. Everyone, this should be no surprise if you know human beings, everyone is interested in stories, from people in museums or galleries trying to create exhibitions that will engage people, to members of the public who need a good story to get hooked, to the creative industries. If you're a journalist or you film, you're like, I want to tell a good story to engage people. And even to academics who are very conscious that it's not the object in itself that's interesting, but it's the context of the object and it's where it sits. Place, also really compelling organizing principle when you think about how do you find a way to make this mass of objects visible in some way to people across everything in this catalog. Being able to see items associated with a certain place was really popular. I think we can see the evidence of this from things like the success of BFI's Britain on Film, runaway success, because people could see where are films about my area or somewhere that I know, really worked. And it's interesting to think about place is definitely popular at the moment more broadly in terms of regeneration. People are looking at placemaking. Leveling up is obviously place-centered. So there's a bit of a sort of a policy lever and a link to wider strategies there, we think, in terms of focusing on place. We also found this real desire for human insight and connection, as I've already touched upon. Really, people need not just the items, but to know what to think, academics and GLAM professionals were very interested in knowing who to ask to learn more. They were excited about this idea that I can see an item that I didn't know about, but then also I know who to ask about that item to find out more. So it's really about connecting people as much as connecting things where people get excited about. And that also leads to this conclusion that a knowledge management platform would offer a major opportunity to add value to the current landscape, that it's providing the data is amazing, but almost where users get excited about filling a gap is what you build on top of the data. And I think I've got, yes, the classic pyramid, which nobody really knows who created this, but it's very useful. On the one hand, you could say, there's a data pipeline, we provide the data, we let people do what they want with it. Then on top of that, this is information, basic search, basic cataloging stuff, basic ways of structuring it. But actually, it's kind of what knowledge, what interpretation, what connections do you build on top of all of that to enable something more? And to explain what I mean by that, this is from a couple of people, academics, I think, who really gave us in this user research quite a powerful vision for how Tank could enable this creation of knowledge. Somebody talked about dissolving the objects into every possible connected bit of knowledge that's attached to them means you'll get a whole new set of interpretations, which would be inherently more accessible. So it's not this just top-down thing of one structure of knowledge, one information architecture, one way of viewing the world. But he had this vision of multiple interpretations, multiple connections. Someone else commented, and I thought this is a wonderfully picturesque notion, objects are just the landscape that people use to identify one another. The extra value is putting communities of users together. Researchers identify other research. The objects are a means to an end. So it was fascinating, the opportunities, the ideas that were opened up by people. We're not saying it necessarily should be like this, but when people started thinking about what didn't exist in the current landscape, that they wanted to see this sort of knowledge connection and personal connection was really popular. Just drawing to a close here, we also found that although we focused on the digital infrastructure and what it ought to be, that there were these wider strategic issues that came up. As many potential users have thought deeply and been around the block in the sector, it's not surprising that they had thoughts. So obviously, there were concerns about the readiness and capacity of the cultural sector, both in terms of the systems and in terms of the cataloging. There was a consciousness that individual organizations need to see the case for participation, that this is going to be something that obviously involves quite a lot of resource and quite a lot of thought. And so the value exchange for them having their collections on national collection needs to be clear. There's obviously a risk of reinforcing existing power structures and dynamics if the big nationals are the only ones that can participate. That reinforces their dominance of the sector, this idea that they are the national collection, which is not quite true. People were also concerned about the need for persistence and sustainability beyond project funding. There have been a lot of digital projects that don't last beyond the initial 5 years or 3 years. So this has to be something that's in it for the long term if it's really going to be able to build that benefit and value of people building on top of the infrastructure. Like collections trust, we found a lot of uncertainty from users over what a national collection might be. What does national mean? So that same sort of kind of bit of cynicism and bit of doubt about that. And last thought that I'd like to leave you with, I suppose, is the question about to what extent the aim of a national collection ought to be to engage people who are currently non-users of collections. Should it be about getting more people searching collections who don't now directly? Should those people be users of the platform? Or is the sort of involving more people in the public a matter of giving GLAM institutions or academics or the creative industries the tools and the access that enables them to engage members of the public better? So that leads to kind of different models. I could go on, but I will draw to a close now because I'm conscious of time. Thank you for listening. Our report has not quite been published yet. There were a few small holdups along the way, but I gather it will be ready soon. And we would look forward to hearing your thoughts on it. If you'd like to get in touch, please do. That is me, I think.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And yes, apologies for the delay in the publishing of the report. It's been human factors, I'm afraid. But the content is complete, it's signed off. It just needs the final design and publishing to happen. So thank you so much to both of our speakers. Javier, I don't know whether it's possible to spotlight Kevin and Sophia so they're on the screen together, or will it just be whoever's speaking?
Yeah, I think whoever's speaking, I don't know.
Okay. Get carried away with what might be possible. We've got one question in the chat, which I think very neatly addresses both of the presentations from Philip Eagle. Philip, do you want to give the question? It's very straightforward, so I can read it out, or you're welcome. I think Javier, can he turn his camera on?
To a degree, just after I typed the question, Kevin answered it by saying that people in smaller institutions are aware of sort of these cutting edge technologies. I was really thinking of sort of the stereotypical small local archive or museum where maybe a lot of the volunteers are possibly retired people, may not be comfortable with this, may not be comfortable with highly sophisticated IT and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, it's obviously a more nuanced picture, would you say?
Indeed, yes. And in fact, you know, a surprising number of museums, in my experience, include amongst their retired volunteers people who've retired after a lifetime working in IT. You know, you definitely get that. So I think it is a mixed picture. I think in some ways, possibly the most challenged institutions are those that are within local authorities, where they are very constrained by the requirements of an IT department that might, you know, is dealing with all sorts of things and doesn't necessarily have the time or inclination to kind of make exceptions for the needs of museums. So I think in some ways local authority museums, particularly smaller ones, you know, in some of the districts, are perhaps in most need of IT support. And I also think it's actually less a matter of kind of IT knowledge as digital literacy. I don't know if Anra wants to come in on this, because there's been a lot of work done on, you know, supporting institutions of all sizes with not specifically IT skills and knowledge, but actually the literacy to know what digital can do for you and actually make it part of your kind of everyday activity.
Anra, do you want to come in on that?
Hello. Hi. Yes, I was just actually typing. I was going to flag another TANK project called Making It Fair, which we worked on with Kevin. And this actually looked at that skills gap as part of that picture, because I'd absolutely agree. There is definitely a need as part of this picture around the National Collection for supporting, and it's not just people in smaller museums. I have to say it applies in different ways, particularly around the literacy across often different scales of museums. So in a larger museum, those skills and knowledge might be there with the people who deal with the collections database directly, but sometimes I'm not there in the wider leadership and across other parts of the museum team. So the Making It Fair report, which I can put that link in, that actually drills into this, and you might find it interesting, Philip and others.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for the extra plug for another one of the reports. Okay, well, in the meantime, I'm going to ask a question of both speakers. Javier, do you have a question, or are you pointing out someone else has a question?
Yeah, there's one in the chat.
There is one in the chat. Ah, got you. Okay, we'll come back to mine then. Yes, Richard, do you want to ask that question directly? And
I can try if you can hear me.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, it's the mention, I think, of a knowledge management platform for all of the aggregated data, and that could allow for more information to be added. And I wondered what more information is added, and how is that round trip back to the institutions so they also accumulate that extra information?
That's an interesting question. The first thing I suppose I should say about the idea is it's not necessarily the case that there would need to be one massive centralized platform built on top. The idea might well be that you have this data infrastructure that allows multiple people to build multiple things on top of the infrastructure using the data that's provided by a national collection. What it might be, you might say, well, there's wraparound interpretation, there's essays, there's ways of linking up different types of objects so that you can kind of say, these are books about these people who are in this painting, who lived in this house, and here's what we know about that. You might say somebody might want to link papers to objects, academic papers. There are all sorts of things that you can imagine once you have all this data together in one place that in theory you could do with it. It might not be that any of this is directly sponsored by the National Collection. It might be that some of it is, but we think that it's quite important to, when thinking about what the infrastructure offers, think about additional functionality for interpretation and analysis and networks that can be built on top of the raw data that might be provided. Would it be returned to the institutions? That's an interesting one, not necessarily. I don't know how you would structure that, but I think it would be available for people to make use of, hopefully.
Richard, do you have any ideas on how it could be returned to the institutions?
Sadly not, no. And I think this is the big issue that always comes up with data synchronization, and especially across such different institutions with different data models as well. And it's been a struggle for anyone to add some of the things that have been discussed for many years about, I think, revisiting collections and adding new forms of knowledge, and yet getting that implemented has not been a thing anyone's found easy to do. So it feels slightly like, do we want to add another? We haven't got the first problem sorted, so are we now adding a second problem with that?
Yeah. So this was something that we really looked at in the project that Anna just mentioned, Making It Fair. So really the name of that project was actually a kind of a pun on the FAIR principles. And the fact is that museums and archives find it really hard to deal with any kind of content that's created outside of the collection management system. And that goes from the whole range from just social media through to research outputs, collaborations, the kind of revisiting collections work that you just mentioned there. So in the Making It Fair report, we actually prototyped the kind of workflow that you could imagine if you have a centralized museum data service with a repository where museums can look up their own data. They can look up data from museums that they want to collaborate with. So if you imagine, say, Wessex Museum Partnership, 4 museums working together, they've all got different collection management systems. They can create new content in a tool that is linked to the data that's in the data repository. They can create this new content collaboratively outside of their collection management systems. They can then send that content on wherever it's going to end up, whether it's social media or an exhibition designer or a website or wherever. But they can also wrap up all of that new content with appropriate metadata and send a copy of it back to the data repository where it can live. Now, it could live as just linked data. So these days, there isn't necessarily a requirement for everything to be re-imported into the museum's own collection management system. It could be that you just link to that, and the metadata, if that includes the unique identifiers of your source records, then you're able to do that. It all comes down, as I was saying earlier, comes down to having kind of persistent identifiers. So once something is online, it has a permanent address, you can link to it, that link is going to stick around for the long term. So I would, commend the Making It Fair report to you, because, that does show a kind of a working model in microcosm of something that we think could be scaled up.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other questions?
Yeah, there was Patrick Towell, I think he wanted to ask a question. So Patrick, you should be able to unmute yourself, or you can type it, whatever you prefer.
Indeed. Thank you. I just thought I'd pick up on what Sophia said about some of the comments about the vision for it, but also the need for something like this. And I suppose both in this work and in other work that we've done, there's this sense of creating a digital commons or some kind of data that's held in trust for the benefit of the public, which is probably the kind of common theme of what the missions of the contributing organisations would be. And the alternative being that in a way the data and the content is balkanized into different private collections, into different technologies, into different kind of commercial operators. And so the urgency, it does feel, albeit that it's quite hard to get the public users to articulate exactly what they would do with it. That it does seem like there is quite a significant risk that if large technology companies do it, then it may not be in line with the kind of fair principles that Anra and Kevin were talking about. So it's more a kind of comment than a question, really, and conceiving of this as a kind of digital commons, a kind of digital public space, perhaps.
Thank you, Patrick. Judy, thank you for your question, which I think probably I'm going to have to answer. But do you want to come on and ask it yourself?
I guess I could sort of set it in context and add a comment to it. It strikes me that on the one hand, there's amazing vision and the different ideas from the user consultation and the huge potential of technology. But at the other level, lots of institutions with really amazing stuff that aren't able to use and make their stuff future-proof, really, by digital preservation and the use of persistent identifiers. And I mean, I'm speaking from an institution that's probably relatively well able to do some things, but still we're struggling. And so there's two almost impossible tasks. One is how do you achieve the vision, and one is how do you, I'm tempted to use the term level up, but I can't think of, I need to have something better. But how do you just, no collection gets left behind, I suppose, is probably what I'm thinking of. And how are you able to respond to those two challenges?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, Kevin mentioned earlier that one of our foundation projects has looked very specifically at persistent identifiers, and that project is now reported, plugging another of our reports. And I actually met with all the foundation projects in London last week, the first time we'd met in person for 2 years. And one of the things I asked all of the projects was what they would like us to try and take forward within the current lifetime of the program, so within the current funding of the program, from their projects. And one of the most probably straightforward and compelling suggestions, which we knew because it was already in their report, was to try and do further work on persistent identifiers. Now, to be realistic, within the current lifetime, that's probably more detailed scoping of how we could do what Kevin's describing, and the sort of creation of useful guidelines. So I think persistent identifiers has come through multiple bits of research as a really important part. The data repositories at the moment sits outside towards a national collection, but it is something that AHRC is putting money into at the moment, both the existing data repositories and scoping new types of data repositories, specifically for the for parts of the cultural sector where the data is not simple. So things like performance data, event data, that kind of thing. So that kind of work is being scoped at the moment, but that's a kind of sister funding towards a national collection. Kevin, do you want to step in and give a definition of a persistent identifier we're being asked?
It's kind of a unique online address that somebody will be answered for the long term. So, and that might include, I mean, if you kind of think of a normal address, you might move house but leave a forwarding address. It can be like that. So if you're an institution that has your collections on your own website with your own domain, and everybody's linking to that, and then your museum rebrands, or your web address changes, it can be that your old links won't work anymore, whereas these links are independent of your own particular house domain name. So they if you change what you do in a public facing way behind the scenes, it sort of stays as a kind of fixed point on the internet that will always return you the results that you want.
Thank you, Kevin.
Sorry, that's a really bad explanation. Sorry.
Javier has also posted a link to a webinar on this specific subject, so you can follow that up, Crispin, if you're interested. Tom, you've got probably another difficult question for me, but do you want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. I just noticed in the slides earlier the term digital research infrastructure was used, which kind of implies a specific or a particular audience for a national collection or whatever the collection is called. But yeah, I mean, my biggest question always with this is who is it for? And is it for researchers, or is it for the general public? Is it for both? Are we nearer to an answer to that question? Sorry, that is a difficult question.
Well, no, it's an incredibly important question. Right from the beginning of the program, the intention has been explicitly to provide a service to both research and to the public. But I would have to say, in reality, some of it will depend on where the money comes from, and what the imperatives of the spending of that money. And that's a soup that we're still in at the moment. So we're working on that in terms of, well, we need an awful lot of money. I think that's the problem. To do this really well, to answer the issues that Kevin and Sophia have raised today, is going to take really significant investment. So we're going to have to be quite strategic about what and who we target for that investment, and how partnerships could be built around that investment. And of course, I've said it many times in presentations that the most likely source of funding is UKRI infrastructure funding, which does of course imply that it has to be of use to research, and indeed it does have to be of use to researchers and to academia. But there's also great interest in making it relevant, accessible, participatory for the public as well. But I would say we haven't bottomed that one out yet, because it rather depends on if anything changes in terms of what funding's available and what those funders want. So sorry, not a very satisfactory answer. Jane Daniels, do you want to come on and talk a little bit about the People's Collection?
Hi, sorry about that. Yes, I'm not in the museum or the collections sector really. I'm a retired cataloguer just this April actually, but I am hoping to do some work with my local museum. From my time in academia though, and particularly from in a Welsh context, I would ask if people could have a look at the People's Collection Wales initiative here in Wales. It's very much in its formative stages. If you visit the link that I put there, you'll see that the collections that are available via it are quite minuscule in terms of what you were talking about earlier, Kevin. But I think perhaps, as with all things, we need to be thinking about how these national initiatives, we don't have to call them that, but what we do need to do is make sure that the aims and objectives, what we're talking about is equality, isn't it really, is connected to the strategic aims of our governments. So for instance, here in Wales, the Welsh Government is very strong on trying to up the educational opportunities for people in Wales. And also in terms of health, they're keen to do this work. And the People's Collection Wales is very heavily linked. All their work is linked to these strategic aims, which are very well documented. And for that reason, they can tap into the funding and also the goodwill of the population. So in terms of the People's Collection Wales, a lot of smaller institutions have uploaded images or oral histories, all kinds of materials. And then what you can do on that in terms of getting out to the users is invite people to add tags to that. So someone may see photographs, you can search by your geographical area. You might see some photographs and you may recognize the people in that photograph. So there's an opportunity for the community to become involved and to actually add the metadata then. So it becomes not just something that a cataloguer or a volunteer in a small museum or community group would be doing. It becomes something that everyone can be involved in. So that's really the point I was making there. I think everyone's right. You do get you get project funding, but what we desperately need is sustainability, because there's far too many things that we've done within the GLAM sector. They're brilliant ideas. They are really brilliant ideas. But once that funding comes to an end, that's where we hit a brick wall, really.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Jane, and that certainly sustainability is going to be very high on our agenda, what we're trying to achieve in future. Thank you for that. Patrick, we are running over time, but as long as our speakers can stay with us a few minutes, do you want to give me a nod or a shake before I let any more questions in? Yep. Okay. Patrick, you've got your hand up.
It was very quickly just responding to the point about the different audiences, I suppose, and this is a policy thing not coming out of the research, but obviously UKRI have a big push towards public engagement, and so it's not entirely incompatible with UKRI funding for that to be a significant element. And I think just picking up on one of the things that Sophia said about us not assuming that there was, for instance, a single portal or a single place to go, was about recognising that there the public, it's very difficult to get them to go to any new place. They tend to go to where they go. And so that embedding results in Google search, but also having perhaps other themed or other services built on top of the infrastructure and on top of the data. That kind of multi-channel approach has been successful in other industries, and would then enable other people to kind of make the effort to reach the public, and it not necessarily to be something that Tank itself has to do. It could be something that it enables others to do, and that's why we concentrated so much on talking to educators and to the kind of creative industries people who might embed stuff into games or do stuff with film, or in other ways kind of contextualize the material further.
Thank you, Patrick. Gil, yes, the recording will be available on the Javier's just beaten me to it. They'll be on our YouTube channel. Okay, so we're running out of time. We can take one more question from the audience, or I have a final question for both speakers. Anybody want to come in? Okay, so Kevin and Sophia, you're both completely steeped in your area of expertise. So I imagine that an awful lot of what you have now provided evidence on, you kind of knew already, but I wonder from each of you, and sorry, I didn't prime you for this question, can each of you identify a surprise within the findings? Doesn't matter how big or small, just something that you really weren't expecting or weren't aware of before.
Shall I go first? Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned already just that the extent to which many people in museums struggle to get access to their own museum's data. So I think, I mean, in terms of audiences for data, actually, if we start with that and we can solve that problem, then actually everybody else will be happy as well.
Good, nice positive finish. Thank you, Kevin. Sophia?
I already mentioned it, but I suppose overall it was the importance of Google, like how large Google looms, both for members of the public, which you would expect, and for professional users, which you might not necessarily expect, and how much they valued it for bringing up things that they wouldn't know to look for already. So just the centrality of Google to all our lives can't be underlined too much. Definitely a surprise. And I suppose with members of the public, that the real depth of the split between people who are used to using collections, who could really imagine how to use something like Tank and could really see the value immediately, and those who weren't, who really saw it in terms of visits and didn't quite understand how else they would engage with it. I mean, it's not surprising given those two modes of engagement, but I think the extent to which the audience self-segmented, members of the public self-segmented in that way was really, really striking.
Okay. Thank you very much to both our speakers. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you very much for the audience, for your questions and for sticking with us. Kevin's report you can read now. Sophia's report is coming very soon. And both of these, as I said at the beginning, are absolutely critical building blocks of evidence for us about how we take things forward. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your days.